3,000 years ago, while the great empires of the ancient world were still writing their first chapters, while Phoenician ships were cutting through the Mediterranean and the Zhou dynasty was rising in China, and while the prophets of Israel were delivering their warnings into the desert wind, something extraordinary was unfolding in the scorching coastal desert of what is now southern Peru. A civilization was carefully burying its most powerful dead inside precisely carved, stone-lined underground chambers, wrapped in textiles so sophisticated and so breathtakingly complex that they would not be matched anywhere in the ancient world for centuries to come. Every layer of fabric, every knot, every strand of dyed fiber reflected an astonishing mastery of craftsmanship, suggesting that these people possessed advanced weaving techniques, symbolic traditions, and social structures far more complex than anyone had once imagined. These burials were not ordinary graves. They were carefully designed ceremonial spaces prepared with incredible precision, where elite individuals were laid to rest alongside treasures gathered from distant regions hundreds of miles away. The people being buried, the ones commanding the most elaborate rituals, the richest grave goods, the gold artifacts and spondylus shells and ceremonial feather fans, carried skulls unlike anything ever documented in the full sweep of the human story before or since, long, dramatically elongated, reaching backward and upward in shapes that defied what the human body was ever supposed to produce. To the first archaeologists who uncovered these remains during the early 20th century, the discovery felt almost surreal. Some believed they had uncovered an unknown branch of humanity. Others argued these individuals represented a forgotten royal bloodline that intentionally altered their appearance to separate themselves from ordinary society. As more tombs were excavated, one astonishing pattern became impossible to ignore. These unusual skulls were not isolated curiosities. They appeared again and again among the highest-ranking members of society, suggesting that this striking appearance carried enormous cultural, political, or even spiritual significance. For nearly a century after their discovery, scientists argued fiercely about what had caused this extraordinary appearance and who these ancient people actually were. Some researchers insisted the skulls were simply the result of intentional cranial modification, a practice documented in several ancient cultures where an infant's head was gently bound with cloth or wooden boards during the earliest months of life. Others pointed to anatomical features that appeared unusually different, even beyond the effects of artificial shaping, fueling endless controversy inside museums, universities, and archaeological circles. Each new excavation seemed to raise even more questions than answers. Were these people descendants of local populations? Did they migrate from distant lands? Or had history forgotten an entire chapter of human movement across the ancient world? Then, in the second decade of the 21st century, someone finally did the one thing that could cut through all the speculation and all the competing theories, and all the institutional silence. They extracted the DNA, tiny fragments of genetic material preserved for thousands of years. Inside ancient bone and teeth, despite Peru's harsh desert climate, were carefully isolated using modern sequencing technology. For the first time, scientists were no longer relying only on skull shape, burial customs, or artistic depictions. They could examine the biological ancestry written into the individuals themselves and what the genetic code revealed about these 3,000-year-old skulls from the Peruvian desert sent a shockwave through the scientific world that has never fully settled. While the results did not support many of the sensational claims that would later spread across the internet, they opened entirely new discussions about ancestry, migration, and the remarkable diversity of ancient populations in the Americas. The findings challenged long-held assumptions, sparked years of further research, and reminded historians that the story of humanity is often far more complicated than the textbooks suggest. Today, these mysterious remains continue to stand at the center of one of archaeology's most fascinating debates. They force us to ask difficult questions about identity, culture, and how civilizations used physical appearance to express power and belief. Every new scientific study adds another piece to an enormous historical puzzle that is still far from complete. Join us now as we go deep into the DNA results from Peru's most mysterious ancient remains, separate established scientific evidence from popular myth, and reveal what the discoveries actually tell us about one of the most extraordinary civilizations ever uncovered beneath the sands of South America. The story begins not in a laboratory, but on a wind-blasted peninsula stretching into the Pacific Ocean off the southern coast of Peru. On October 25, 1927, Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello and his team uncovered the first of what would become hundreds of ceremonial mummified bundle burials at a site on the Paracas Peninsula. Tello had first visited the area in 1925, following rumors of remarkable ancient textiles circulating on the black market. And he was the first archaeologist in Peru to apply truly scientific excavation methods, carefully preserving stratigraphy and context to establish dating and meaning. What Tello found inside those sand-buried chambers was unlike anything academic training had prepared him to encounter. Across the 1928 and 1929 digs, Tello and his colleague Toribio Mejia Gespe excavated a total of 429 mummies, placed into categories based on their size and the complexity of their burial preparation. The most elite among them were wrapped not once, but in layer after layer of textile, each piece more intricate than the last, a final gift of extraordinary craftsmanship. From a people who understood deeply that how you buried your dead said everything about who you believed them to have been in life. An elite Paracas man would have been a dazzling sight in the desert, adorned with concentrated finery that radiated status, power, and spiritual authority. His burial included ceramics, gold items, spondylus shells, and feather fans, surrounded by embroidered textiles made from coastal cotton and highland camelid wool imported from hundreds of miles away. These were not the burials of common people. These were the burials of rulers, of priests, of those believed to stand closer to the divine than ordinary human beings ever could. And the Paracas culture, which existed between approximately 800 BCE and 100 BCE in what is now the Ica region of Peru, possessed extensive knowledge of irrigation and water management and made remarkable contributions to the textile arts that placed them among the most technically accomplished civilizations of the ancient Americas. But it was not the gold or the textiles or even the remarkable burial practices that stopped the scientific world in its tracks. It was the skulls, more than 300 of them, recovered from the tombs, each one bearing the same unmistakable, deeply disturbing characteristic. Dramatically, impossibly elongated craniums that stretched backward and upward in shapes no natural human developmental process had ever been documented to produce on its own. The cranial volume of the Paracas skulls is up to 25% larger and 60% heavier than conventional human skulls, meaning they could not have been intentionally deformed through head binding, or flattening alone. They also contain only one parietal plate, rather than the two found in all normal human skulls. This last detail is the one that silenced the easy explanations. When you bind a human skull from infancy, applying constant pressure over years to reshape soft, developing bone, you can change the direction of growth dramatically. What you cannot do, what no amount of binding or boards or cloth wrapping has ever been documented to achieve, is change the fundamental number of bone plates that make up the skull's architecture. That is determined in the womb. It is coded in the genes before a child ever draws its first breath. Some researchers additionally noted the apparent absence of the sagittal suture, the connective tissue joint that normally runs down the center of the skull in some of the most extreme Paracas specimens. Furthermore, the position of the foramen, magnum, the critical opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord attaches to the brain, has been identified as anomalous in certain specimens, appearing further back than in typical humans, which would suggest a completely different center of gravity and potentially a unique method of movement and posture. These are not superficial observations. These are deep structural features of the skull, features that speak to how the bone grew in the first place, how the entire architecture of the cranium was organized from its earliest formation. And when you add them all together, the enlarged volume, the single parietal plate, the absent sagittal suture, the repositioned foramen magnum, you arrive at a body of physical evidence that the standard cultural explanation, the head binding theory, simply cannot contain on its own. And the Paracas people were doing something else with their skulls that makes this civilization even more staggering. A significant percentage, between 40 and 60% of skulls discovered in Paracas burial sites bear variously shaped perforations. The Paracas were practitioners of cranial trepanation, a surgical procedure involving the removal of a portion of the skull. These operations were performed on living individuals, with some even undergoing multiple trepanations, evidenced by skulls with multiple perforations. Scientists assert that individuals subjected to such procedures not only survived but displayed bone growth around the trepanned areas, indicating healing and post-operative recovery. Think about the weight of that discovery. Brain surgery, performed 3,000 years ago with obsidian knives and bone instruments on the coast of a South American desert, with survival rates that would have impressed surgeons working in Europe as recently as the 19th century. The oldest evidence of trepanation anywhere is a skull dating from 3,000 years BCE from the region of Paracas itself, making this civilization not just a practitioner of skull surgery, but quite possibly its originator on the American continent. These were not primitive people stumbling through the dark. These were a society in command of biological knowledge, so advanced that modern researchers are still struggling to fully explain how they achieved what the bones tell us they achieved. And then the DNA arrived, and everything became infinitely more complex. Extracting genetic material from 3,000-year-old remains demands extraordinary conditions and extraordinary care. DNA degrades relentlessly after death, broken down by bacteria, moisture, heat, and the chemistry of decomposition. What saved the Paracas samples was the desert itself. The extreme aridity of the Paracas Peninsula, one of the driest environments anywhere on Earth, had acted for millennia as a natural preservation chamber, slowing molecular breakdown to a crawl and leaving usable genetic fragments, trapped inside hair, teeth, bone, and preserved skin. Researchers worked in fully sterile conditions, wearing complete protective gear, sterilizing every instrument, terrified of introducing a single modern skin cell that could corrupt results that had been sealed and waiting for 3,000 years. They targeted mitochondrial DNA specifically, the maternal genetic lineage passed from mother to daughter in an unbroken chain, far more durable than nuclear DNA, and far better suited to tracing the deep ancestry of ancient populations across thousands of years. The results were sent to independent laboratories in the United States and Europe for cross-referencing, and then the data came back, and the scientists stared at it and stared at it again. DNA samples were taken from 18 different skulls. Instead of the Native American haplogroups that every researcher in that room expected to find, some samples returned haplogroups commonly linked to populations from the Black Sea and Crimea region, including U2E, K, J, and H. These designations are not abstract. Each one represents a specific maternal lineage with a specific geographic origin point, a chain of mothers stretching backward through time to a particular corner of the ancient world. And not one of those corners was in South America, not one was in North America, not one was anywhere in the Westerns Hemisphere. One skull, bearing what appeared to be genetic red hair, was found to carry the mitochondrial haplogroup U2E, meaning that its place of origin was likely in the Caucasus area, in the region between the Caspian and Black Seas. Other hair samples showed haplogroup H2A, which strongly suggests an origin in extreme Eastern Europe and the Caucasus Mountains. A Paracas royal infant, estimated at 18 to 22 months old at the time of death, showed the maternal haplogroup U2E1 found on the European continent, but not in South America. A skull found in the same elite tomb revealed haplogroup T2B, another indicator pointing toward European and Near Eastern ancestry. Further testing of the La Arroya skull, which died some 850 years ago, also showed haplogroup T2B, a royal infant, a child of the highest Paracas bloodline, buried with the full ceremony reserved for those of divine descent, carrying in its tiny bones a genetic signature born thousands of miles away on the other side of the planet. The emotional weight of that image is almost impossible to process. Someone held that child. Someone wrapped it with the same extraordinary textile care given to the adult rulers. And that child's mother and her mother before her all carried a lineage that stretched back not to the Andes, but to the ancient world of the Caucasus, of Eastern Europe, of the same geographic corridor that gave birth to some of the most consequential cultures in human history. When 10 of the Paracas elongated, skulls' blood types were tested. They should have been 100% type O because that is the consistent blood type of Native American populations. Instead, the results showed high percentages of type A, a small percentage of type B, a very high percentage of type AB, and less than half of the sample was type O. The Paracas were, according to these findings, an incredibly complex ethnic mix of people whose haplogroups did not fit with the history of Peru in any shape or form. Blood type cannot be changed by climate, cannot be altered by time, cannot shift under the pressure of desert preservation. It is what it is, and what these results said was undeniable. The Paracas elite were not a purely Andean population. They carried genetic material from somewhere far beyond the known boundaries of their world. Researcher Brian Forster, who led much of the DNA investigation work on the Paracas skulls, proposed a specific migration hypothesis, grounded in the comparative geographic distribution of elongated skulls worldwide. He noted that the largest elongated skulls on the planet had been found in two primary locations: Paracas, Peru, and the Caucasus area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. His proposed migration pattern began in the Black Sea and Caspian region, moved through the Persian Gulf, and tracked eastward, eventually reaching the coast of Peru. And crucially, the Caucasian skulls were not merely similar in shape to the Paracas specimens. Skulls found in the Crimea region of the Black Sea area carry shape similarities with the Paracas skulls, are approximately the same age at around 2,300 years old, and carry similar DNA haplogroups, the same shape, the same age, the same DNA, on opposite sides of the planet, separated by more than 10,000 miles of ocean and continent. This is not a coincidence that any honest scientific mind can't simply dismiss with a wave of the hand. The parent haplogroup of H2A is H2, which very likely originated near the Caspian Sea, supporting the Armenian and Crimean genetic connections. This evidence suggests that ancestors of the Paracas people somehow traveled to coastal Peru via the Indian and Pacific Oceans sometime between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. The proposed route, entering through the Persian Gulf and tracking eastward across the Indian Ocean and then the Pacific, follows currents that ancient seafarers from the Caucasus and greater Eurasian world could have navigated. Polynesian peoples were already making extraordinary deep ocean voyages across the Pacific during precisely this same era, navigating by stars and waves and the behavior of birds, covering distances that European sailors would not dare to attempt for another 1,000 years. The idea that a genetically distinct population from the Black Sea region found its way to the Peruvian coast over generations of ocean migration belongs not in the realm of fantasy, but in the realm of deeply challenging historical possibility, the kind of possibility that forces us to radically reconsider how capable ancient humans truly were. What gives this migration theory even greater weight is what the Paracas civilization built and left behind in the landscape itself. Archaeological surveys have revealed that the Paracas people created geoglyphs in the Chincha Valley that predate the famous Nazca lines by at least 3 centuries. A mound complex with astronomical orientations and linear geoglyphs has been identified as a ceremonial center for the Paracas culture existing between 800 and 100 BCE, designed with precision that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of celestial movement. The world knows the Nazca lines. Tourists fly over them by the millions. But almost nobody knows that the tradition of carving enormous images into the Peruvian desert did not begin with the Nazca. It began with the Paracas. In 2018, drones used by archaeologists revealed 25 geoglyphs in the Palpa province assigned to the Paracas culture, many predating the associated Nazca lines by 1,000 years. A civilization that performed brain surgery, wove the most complex textiles in the ancient Americas, built astronomical ceremonial centers, buried its dead with extraordinary ritual, created the geoglyph tradition later made famous by their successors, and, according to the DNA, carried genetic lineages from the other side of the world. That is not the profile of an isolated, locally evolved desert society. That is the profile of a people who arrived carrying knowledge from somewhere else. This is the point at which the scientific and institutional worlds grow most uncomfortable, and where the most serious allegation surrounding the Paracas mystery takes hold. Reports have circulated, persistently and credibly, that Peruvian museums and institutions holding the most critical Paracas specimens have repeatedly blocked or restricted requests for additional independent DNA testing. If the data is wrong, if the haplogroups identified by the initial research are contamination artifacts or methodological errors, then allowing rigorous peer-reviewed testing on multiple specimens would prove that quickly and definitively. The reluctance to permit that testing, whatever its true motivation, produces only one practical outcome. The mystery remains permanently open. The challenge to the established narrative of the Americas remains impossible to fully resolve, and the people who found foreign genetic signatures in a royal Peruvian burial ground 3,000 years old are left without the follow-up research that science demands and that the evidence deserves. Because if the DNA is right, the implications reach far beyond Peru. They reach beyond the question of who the Paracas were. They reach into the very foundation of how we understand the ancient world's capacity for movement, for contact, for the exchange of knowledge and bloodline across distances that we have spent centuries assuming were impassable. If a genetically Caucasian population was burying its royal dead in the Peruvian desert 800 years before the birth of Christ, then ancient humans were crossing oceans at a time when nobody, according to the official story, had any business being on those oceans at all. The Bering Land Bridge model, which has served as the bedrock explanation for how people came to inhabit the Americas, cannot account for a Caucasian royal infant carrying haplogroup U2E1 in a tomb on the Pacific coast of South America. That child arrived some other way. Its ancestors traveled some other route. And that route, whatever it was, has been erased so completely from the historical record that we cannot yet reconstruct it with certainty. The Paracas culture eventually faded, their civilization absorbed and transformed into what would become the Nazca, who carried forward the tradition of desert geoglyphs into the form the world now knows. But the elongated skulls stayed. They waited in the stone tombs under the desert sand, preserved by the same arid silence that had swallowed the Paracas civilization whole, patient as only the dead can be patient, holding inside their ancient bone structure a message that no amount of passing time could fully erase. When Julio Teo's hands finally reached them in 1927, after 2 millennia of undisturbed desert burial, they began their slow journey back into human awareness. And when the DNA finally spoke in the second decade of the 21st century, it spoke in a voice that nobody in that laboratory had been prepared to hear. 3,000 years ago, someone from the ancient world between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea made a journey so extraordinary that we still cannot fully explain it. They carried their bloodline across an ocean. They buried their dead with a reverence and a sophistication that still astonishes us. They shaped their skulls in ways that may reflect not just cultural aspiration, but biological memory, an inherited physical legacy of a lineage that had carried this cranial tendency for generations before they ever set foot in South America. They performed brain surgery. They drew enormous images on the desert floor centuries before the Nazca made those images famous. And then they vanished, leaving behind only their bones, their textiles, their surgical marks, their geoglyphs, and the DNA time capsule that a Peruvian desert preserved for 3,000 years until science finally had the tools to read it. The skulls are still there. They sit in museums in Peru, in locked collections and restricted storage rooms, waiting for the full scientific attention they deserve and have not yet fully received. The DNA has spoken once, it deserves to speak again under the strictest peer-reviewed conditions with every modern genetic tool available with full transparency and full access for independent researchers across the world. Because what it said the first time was not a small thing. What it said was that history is stranger than we have been taught, that ancient humans were more capable than we have been given credit for, and that somewhere in the deep past, a people from the far side of the planet found their way to a desert peninsula in Peru and became royalty. The full truth of how they got there is still waiting to be told, and until the institutions that guard those bones finally open them to honest science, one of the most extraordinary chapters in human history will remain America's most frustratingly incomplete mystery. What do you think? Does the DNA evidence from these ancient Peruvian skulls point to a forgotten chapter of human migration that could reshape everything we know about the ancient world? Or does the mystery run even deeper than the genetic evidence suggests? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story opened a door inside your mind that you cannot close, click the next video on your screen right now and do not forget to like. And subscribe for more deep dives into the greatest unsolved mysteries in human history.